Have you ever lost control of your mind and only realized it when it was already too late? Not in a dramatic way, just a moment where you reacted, said something you didn't mean, or felt overwhelmed without knowing exactly why. And only afterward did you notice how fast it all happened. Most days your mind is already running before you even notice you're awake. Thoughts decide how you feel, feelings decide how you act, and it all feels normal, so you assume you're in control. But what if I told you that you were never taught how to truly think? You were taught what to think, how to react, how to fit in, but not how to observe what's happening inside you. This isn't about stopping thoughts or changing who you are. It's about noticing something most people miss their entire lives, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You think all the time. From the moment you wake up until you fall asleep, thoughts keep moving, commenting, judging, planning, remembering. And because this happens constantly, you assume that thinking is something you do consciously, that you are the thinker. But here is the subtle shift most people never make. Thinking is not the same as observing your thoughts. Most of the day, thinking happens automatically. A thought appears, then another follows it, and another, like a chain reaction. You don't choose the first one. You usually don't choose the second either. They simply arise, triggered by habits, memories, emotions, or external events. And because they feel so close, so intimate, you mistake them for yourself. You say, I am angry, I am worried, I am not good enough, without realizing that what's actually happening is an angry thought appeared, a worried story started, an old belief repeated itself. Observing thought is something entirely different. Observation creates distance. When you observe, you are no longer inside the storm. You're not being pushed around by every mental movement. You're standing still while thoughts move. This is not a metaphor meant to sound mystical. It's a very practical inner experience. The moment you notice, I am thinking, instead of being lost in the content of the thought, something shifts. There is space. And in that space, you're no longer completely controlled. Think of the last time you replayed a conversation in your head. Maybe someone said something that bothered you. Your mind went over it again and again, adding new lines, better comebacks, imagined reactions. While this was happening, your body reacted too. Tension, faster heartbeat, a sense of irritation or heaviness. That's thinking without observation. You're inside the loop, feeding it without noticing you're doing so. Now imagine the same situation, but at some point you catch it. Not to stop it, not to judge it, just to notice. This is a thought replaying itself. In that moment, the thought is still there, but it loses some of its grip. You're no longer completely identified with it. You're watching it, and watching changes the relationship. Most people never experience this distinction clearly because no one teaches it. From an early age, you're trained to react mentally. Someone says something, you respond. A feeling arises, you explain it. A problem appears, you think harder. There's value in thinking, of course, but without observation, thinking becomes mechanical. It becomes a reflex, not a choice. When you don't observe your thoughts, they define your reality. They decide how you feel, how you act, what you believe is possible. A single unobserved thought like, "This always happens to me," can color an entire day. And because it feels true, you don't question it. You live inside it. Observation is what allows you to see that a thought is an event, not a fact. Something appearing in awareness, not an absolute truth. This is why people often say, I tried to control my thoughts, but it didn't work. Control is still happening from inside the thinking process. It's one thought fighting another thought. Observation is different. It's stepping out of the fight altogether. You're not trying to replace a negative thought with a positive one. You're noticing the movement of the mind itself. There's a quiet intelligence in this noticing. When you observe without trying to change anything, the mind naturally slows down. Not because you forced it to, but because it's no longer being fed by constant identification. Thoughts thrive on attention mixed with belief. When attention becomes neutral and spacious, the thought completes its cycle and dissolves on its own. This doesn't mean thoughts disappear forever. They won't. The mind is designed to think, but the quality of your inner life changes when observation becomes more frequent than identification. You start to notice patterns. You see how the same types of thoughts appear in similar situations. You recognize old mental habits before they fully take over. And most importantly, you begin to sense that you are not those habits. At first, observation might feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. The mind is used to being in charge. When you step back and watch it, there can be a subtle feeling of uncertainty. If I'm not my thoughts, then what am I? This question doesn't need an immediate answer. In fact, trying to answer it with another thought misses the point. The value is in staying with the experience of observing itself, and something else becomes clear over time. Your mind was never trained to choose. It was trained to react. Observing thought is the first interruption of that lifelong training. It creates a pause, and in that pause, a new possibility quietly appears. Not yet a new way of thinking, but the possibility of not reacting automatically. This is where real freedom begins to take shape. Not by adding more mental effort, but by seeing what's already happening. When you can observe a thought without immediately following it, you're no longer on autopilot. You're present. And presence is what allows choice to enter the picture. As this capacity grows, you may start to notice something surprising. Many of the thoughts you assumed were you are just echoes, repetitions, learned responses. And once you see that clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. The question then naturally arises, almost on its own. If so much of my thinking is reactive, conditioned, repeated, where did it come from, and why does it feel so automatic? From the moment you were very young, your mind began learning one main skill: how to react. Not how to choose, not how to pause, not how to observe, but how to respond quickly to what was happening around you. A look from an adult, a tone of voice, a rule, a reward, a punishment. Your nervous system adapted long before you had the language to question it. And this training was not intentional or malicious. It was simply survival. As a child, reacting was useful. If something felt threatening, you learned to defend yourself. If approval felt safe, you learned to seek it. If silence avoided conflict, you learned to stay quiet. These responses became patterns, and those patterns slowly turned into thoughts. Over time, the mind learned shortcuts. When this happens, think this. When that happens, feel that. What once protected you eventually became automatic. The problem is that the mind never updated its software. The reactions that helped you navigate childhood are often the same ones running your adult life. Someone criticizes you, and before you even notice, a defensive thought appears. A situation feels uncertain, and your mind rushes to worry. You're not choosing these responses. They happen faster than choice. That's reaction. Choice requires space. Reaction fills the space before you even realize there was one. This is why so many people feel trapped inside their own heads. They believe they are deciding, but in reality, old conditioning is deciding for them. The mind reacts first, explains later, and then calls that explanation me. This is also why willpower alone doesn't work. You can promise yourself to think differently, to be calmer, to not overreact. But when the trigger appears, the body reacts before the promise even comes to mind. The heart rate changes, muscles tighten, and thoughts follow the physical signal. Reaction is not just mental, it's embodied. Most people don't realize how deeply this is wired because reaction feels normal. It feels like personality. That's just how I am. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the same situations tend to produce the same inner responses, the same mental phrases, the same emotional tones. That repetition is a clue. It tells you this isn't conscious choice, it's training. Choosing, on the other hand, is not loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't feel urgent. Choice appears only after reaction is seen. And this is where observation becomes essential. Without observing the reactive pattern as it happens, you can't interrupt it. You can't choose something different because you never see the moment where choice could exist. Think about a moment when someone said something that triggered you. The reaction was immediate. A thought like, "They don't respect me," or "Here we go again," appeared without invitation. That thought then shaped your tone, your words, your behavior. Later you might reflect and think, "I wish I had responded differently." But the wishing happens after the reaction has already passed. What if the real skill isn't finding a better response later, but noticing the reaction earlier? Noticing the first mental movement before it turns into a story. That noticing doesn't require effort, it requires presence, and presence is something your mind was never trained to value. From school to work to relationships, speed is rewarded. Quick answers, fast decisions, immediate reactions. Rarely are you encouraged to pause and feel what's happening before responding. So the mind associates speed with safety. Slowing down feels risky. Silence feels uncomfortable. And yet, that uncomfortable pause is where choice lives. This doesn't mean reactions are bad or wrong. The mind reacts because it's trying to protect you. It wants to avoid pain, rejection, failure. But protection based on old data can create unnecessary suffering in the present. The mind treats today like the past because it doesn't know how to do anything else unless it's observed. The shift from reaction to choice doesn't happen by force. You can't command your mind to stop reacting. That's just another reaction. The shift happens when you begin to recognize reaction as it arises. When you feel the familiar tightening in the body. When you hear the familiar tone of an old thought. That recognition alone creates a small gap. In that gap, something new becomes possible. Not a perfect response, not a rehearsed line, but a moment of awareness. And awareness changes the quality of the moment. You may still react, but you react with less blindness. Over time, those gaps widen, and what once felt automatic begins to feel optional. As this process deepens, you may start to question something fundamental. If so many of your thoughts are reactions learned over time, repeated without conscious choice, then how many of the thoughts you call mine are actually borrowed, inherited, or absorbed without permission? And if that's true, when was the last time you had a thought that wasn't just a repetition of something you were taught to think? What you usually call a thought feels personal, intimate, and original. It sounds like your own inner voice, speaking in your tone, using your words. Because of that, you rarely question where it comes from. You assume it belongs to you. But when you slow down and really listen, you begin to notice something unsettling. Most thoughts are not new. They are repetitions. The mind is an expert at replaying. It reuses old phrases, old conclusions, old explanations. It pulls from memory and conditioning far more often than it creates something fresh. A situation happens, and the mind reaches for the closest familiar script. That script might sound like logic, but it's often just habit wearing a reasonable mask. Think about how often you tell yourself the same things. This is how it always goes. I'm not good at this. People can't be trusted. These statements may feel true, but they are rarely examined. They were learned somewhere, from family, culture, past experiences, and then repeated so many times that they became background noise. Eventually, you stop hearing them as thoughts and start experiencing them as reality. This repetition is efficient. The mind likes efficiency. Creating a new thought requires energy and uncertainty. Repeating an old one feels safe. Even if the thought is painful, familiar pain feels more predictable than unknown possibility. So the mind sticks with what it knows. That's why many people feel stuck in the same emotional patterns for years. The external circumstances may change, but the internal commentary remains almost identical. New job, same self-doubt. New relationship, same fears. Different setting, same inner voice. It's not because life isn't offering something new, it's because the mind keeps interpreting everything through the same lens. And because these thoughts repeat so quickly, you rarely notice them as separate events. They blend into a continuous stream. You don't think, a thought just appeared saying I'm not enough. You simply feel the weight of not being enough. The thought hides inside the emotion. Observation fades, and identification takes over. This is where the power of noticing repetition becomes transformative. When you recognize that a thought has been here before, something loosens. You start to see it as a pattern rather than a truth, a loop rather than a message. That recognition doesn't require analysis. It's more like a quiet realization. Oh, this again. At first, this can be uncomfortable. If thoughts are repetitive, then the sense of being a constant thinker, a unique inner narrator, begins to crack. You may wonder, if this isn't original, then what part of this is actually me? That question can feel unsettling, but it's also the beginning of clarity. Repetitive thoughts often carry borrowed voices: a parent's fear, a teacher's judgment, society's expectations. They live on inside you long after the original source is gone. And because they speak in your head, you mistake them for your own wisdom. You defend them. You obey them. You organize your life around them. The mind doesn't announce, "This is a repeated belief from the past." It simply speaks. And unless you observe, you listen as if it's giving you fresh information. This is how repetition gains power, through invisibility. Once you start observing, something interesting happens. You notice not just the words of a thought, but its tone, its emotional flavor, its timing. You see how certain thoughts appear at specific moments, almost like clockwork: before a challenge, after a mistake, during quiet moments when nothing is actually wrong. This predictability reveals the mechanical nature of thought, and yet the mind insists on treating these thoughts as urgent, as if this time is different, as if this repetition finally deserves full attention. But when you don't immediately follow it, when you don't argue with it or believe it, the thought begins to lose momentum. Not because you defeated it, but because repetition cannot survive without engagement. This doesn't mean that all thoughts are useless or false. Some are practical, some are creative. But until you can tell the difference between a living thought and a recycled one, the mind keeps running the same programs. Observation is what allows you to see the difference. As you become more familiar with this process, a subtle curiosity may arise. If so much of thinking is repetition, then what exists underneath it? What remains when the mind pauses between one repeated thought and the next? There's often a brief moment there, easy to miss, where nothing is being said at all. It's not blank or dull. It's quiet and alert, and it doesn't comment on itself. This quiet presence doesn't repeat because it doesn't speak in the same way. You can't capture it with words. You can only notice it when thought steps aside for a moment. That moment may be short, but it's revealing. It suggests that thought is not the source of awareness, but something that appears within it. And if that's true, then mastery doesn't come from producing better thoughts, but from recognizing the space in which all thoughts appear and disappear. If you pay close attention, not to your thoughts, but to what notices them, you may begin to sense something unexpected. Beneath the constant movement of the mind, there is a quiet point. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it doesn't comment, and most importantly, it does not think. Yet it is undeniably there. This can sound abstract until it becomes experiential. Right now, as you read these words, thoughts may appear about their meaning, whether you agree, or how this relates to your life. But something else is also present. Something is aware that you are reading. That awareness is steady, it doesn't rush, it doesn't jump ahead. It simply knows what is happening. That is the silent point. You were never taught to notice it because it doesn't demand attention. The thinking mind is loud and persuasive. It pulls focus toward problems, plans, memories. Silence doesn't compete. It waits. And because it waits, it's often overlooked. This silent point is not something you need to create. It's not the result of effort or discipline. It's already here, even when you're stressed, distracted, or overwhelmed. The difference is not its presence, but whether you're aware of it. Most of the time, attention is glued to thought, so awareness seems to disappear into the noise, but awareness itself never leaves. When thinking slows for even a brief moment, this becomes obvious. There may be a pause between thoughts so quick you almost miss it. In that pause, nothing is being said internally, and yet you are still here, still aware, still present. That alone reveals something important. You do not need thought to exist. The mind often resists this realization. It may respond with confusion or discomfort. If I'm not thinking, who am I? It tries to turn silence into a concept, to define it, to control it. But silence can't be captured that way. The moment you think about it, you're already one step away from it. This is why many people mistake silence for emptiness or absence. They assume that without thought, there is nothing. But the experience is the opposite. The silent point is full. Not full of ideas or words, but full of presence. There is clarity without commentary, awareness without narration. In daily life, This silent point shows up more often than you realize. It's present when you suddenly notice your breath, when you're deeply focused on a simple task, when you're listening fully to someone without preparing your response. In those moments, thinking is minimal, but awareness is strong. You feel more grounded, more real. The reason this point feels unfamiliar is not because it's rare, but because it doesn't match how you've learned to identify yourself. You are taught, implicitly and explicitly, that you are your thoughts, your opinions, your inner voice. So discovering a part of you that exists without thinking can feel like losing control. But it's actually the opposite. This silent point doesn't replace the mind, it contains it. Thoughts come and go within it, like sounds in a quiet room. The room doesn't need to react to each sound to remain a room. In the same way, awareness doesn't need to engage with every thought to remain present. When you begin to recognize this, your relationship with thinking starts to change. Thoughts are no longer the center of your identity. They become events you notice, tools you use, signals you interpret. They still matter, but they no longer define you completely. This is also why silence is often uncomfortable at first. Without constant thinking, the mind feels exposed. It loses its familiar sense of control. It may rush to fill the space with commentary, but if you don't follow it, if you simply notice the urge to think without acting on it, the urge softens. You may also notice that this silent point is not cold or distant. It has a quality of calm attention. There is a sense of being okay, even when nothing is being solved. That calm doesn't depend on circumstances. It's not excited when things go well, or threatened when things go wrong. It simply observes. And observation from this place feels different. It's not analytical. It's receptive. It sees without immediately labeling. This is why, from silence, insight can arise naturally, not as forced thinking, but as a clear perception that appears fully formed. As you become more familiar with this silent point, another realization may emerge. If there is a place within you that doesn't think and yet remains aware of every thought, emotion, and sensation, then the emotions you struggle with may not be as solid as they seem. They too appear and disappear within this awareness. This opens a new question, one that becomes impossible to ignore once silence is recognized. If thoughts arise and fade within awareness, and emotions rise in response to unexamined thoughts, then what is the true source of emotional suffering? And what happens to an emotion the moment the thought behind it is seen clearly? Every negative emotion feels immediate. It hits the body first. Tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a rush of heat, a heaviness behind the eyes. Because the sensation is so physical, it's easy to believe the emotion came out of nowhere, that something outside caused it directly. But if you slow the moment down just a little, you'll notice something subtle that almost always comes first. A thought that was never seen. An emotion does not appear in a vacuum. Before fear, there is a story. Before anger, there is an interpretation. Before sadness, there is a meaning assigned to what happened. The problem is not that these thoughts exist. The problem is that they usually pass unnoticed. They slip in quietly, are accepted instantly, and then disappear behind the emotional wave they create. Take anxiety as an example. It often feels like a background state, something that's just there. But anxiety is fueled by thoughts about the future. Images, predictions, silent questions like, what if this goes wrong, or what if I can't handle it? These thoughts happen so quickly that you don't register them as thoughts. You only feel the tension they produce. And because the thought wasn't observed, the emotion feels inevitable. Anger works the same way. Someone says something, and suddenly there's heat, irritation, a sharp edge inside. It feels justified, but just beneath the anger, there's usually a thought like, this shouldn't be happening, or they're disrespecting me, or I'm being treated unfairly. The mind interprets the situation, accepts its own interpretation as truth, and the body reacts. The emotion is real, but it is born from a mental conclusion that was never questioned. This doesn't mean emotions are wrong or that you should suppress them. Emotions are signals. They show you where attention is locked onto an unexamined belief. When a thought is fully believed, the body responds as if that belief describes reality. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between a real threat and a mentally imagined one. It reacts to meaning. Most people try to deal with emotions at the emotional level. They try to calm down, distract themselves, or push the feeling away. Sometimes this works temporarily, but the pattern returns because the source was never seen. The unobserved thought remains active, ready to produce the same emotion again the next time it's triggered. What's often surprising is how fragile the connection really is. When a thought is brought into awareness clearly, without immediately agreeing or disagreeing with it, the emotion begins to change. Not because you forced it to, but because the fuel has been exposed. An unobserved thought has power. An observed thought loses its authority. This is easiest to see in real time, in small moments. You feel a sudden drop in mood. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you pause and look inward, not to analyze deeply, but to notice what just passed through the mind. Often you'll catch a simple sentence, something like, "I'm falling behind," or "They don't care," or "This isn't enough." When you see it clearly, you realize it's just a thought, not a prophecy, not a fact, just a sentence that appeared. The emotion doesn't vanish instantly, but it softens. It becomes less convincing. There's more space around it. And in that space, you're no longer completely inside the emotion. You're aware of it. That awareness is not cold or distant. It's gentle. It allows the feeling to be there without being completely defined by it. This is why emotional mastery is not about control. You can't command emotions to stop. They respond to meaning, not orders. But you can observe the meaning that created them. And observation changes the relationship. Over time, you may notice that certain emotions show up with very familiar thoughts, the same triggers, the same inner phrases. This repetition is not a flaw. It's an opportunity. Each repeated emotion is pointing to a thought that wants to be seen, not fixed, not argued with. Seen. There is also an important distinction to make here. Physical sensations and emotions are not the same as thoughts. Pain in the body, fatigue, hunger, these can exist without mental stories. But suffering intensifies when a thought attaches to the sensation. This will never end. Something is wrong. I can't handle this. That attachment turns sensation into distress. When the thought is observed, the emotion often becomes more manageable, sometimes even instructive. You begin to learn from it instead of fighting it. The emotion becomes information rather than an enemy. This process requires honesty. It's tempting to believe that emotions are caused entirely by external events. And it's true that events matter, but two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different emotions. The difference lies in interpretation, in thought. As awareness grows, a new kind of responsibility appears, not the heavy kind that blames you for feeling bad, but a quiet recognition that inner experience is deeply connected to what goes unnoticed. And this recognition leads naturally to a deeper question. If observing a thought can soften an emotion, what happens when you stop trying to control the mind altogether and instead relate to it in a completely different way? At some point, almost everyone who becomes aware of their inner chaos reaches the same conclusion. I need to control my mind. It sounds reasonable. If thoughts create emotions and emotions shape your life, then controlling thoughts seems like the solution. But this is where a subtle trap appears. The desire to control the mind often creates more conflict than freedom. Control assumes an enemy. It implies that the mind is doing something wrong and must be forced into behaving correctly. So people begin to monitor their thoughts aggressively. They try to replace negative thoughts with positive ones. They fight unwanted thoughts, judge themselves for having them, and measure their progress by how calm or optimistic they feel. On the surface, this looks like discipline. Underneath, it's tension. The first problem is simple but often overlooked. The mind that tries to control is the same mind that produces the thoughts. When a thought arises and another thought immediately says, "I shouldn't think this," nothing has actually changed. One thought is now fighting another. The battlefield is still the mind. The noise may even increase. This is why many people feel exhausted by self-improvement. They're constantly correcting themselves internally. Think better. Be calmer. Don't react. But the effort itself is reactive. It tightens the body. It creates pressure. And pressure doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to suppression. Suppressed thoughts don't disappear. They go underground. They wait for moments of weakness, stress, or fatigue, and then they return with more force. This is why someone can practice positive thinking all day and still feel overwhelmed at night. The thoughts were never understood. They were just pushed away. Another hidden cost of control is self-judgment. When you believe you must control your mind, every unwanted thought feels like a personal failure. I'm doing this wrong. I should be past this by now. That judgment becomes a new layer of thinking, often harsher than the original thought. The mind turns against itself. What's rarely questioned is the assumption behind control, that peace comes from having the right thoughts. But peace doesn't come from perfect thinking. It comes from a different relationship with thinking, a relationship based on awareness rather than dominance. Notice how control feels in the body. There is usually effort, tightness, a sense of pushing. Now notice how observation feels. There is space, curiosity. Even when the thought is uncomfortable, observation allows it to be seen without resistance. And what is not resisted doesn't need to fight back. This doesn't mean you let thoughts run your life unchecked. It means you stop trying to micromanage them. You allow them to arise and you watch, not with passivity but with presence. Over time, you'll notice that thoughts naturally come and go when they're not being fed by fear or judgment. There's also an important misunderstanding about losing control. Many people fear that if they stop controlling their mind, it will spiral out of control. But what actually happens is the opposite. The mind becomes calmer when it's not under constant surveillance. Like a child who acts out when overly restricted, the mind settles when it's met with attention instead of force. True mastery is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like effort. It feels like clarity. You still think, you still plan, you still evaluate. But thinking becomes a tool, not a tyrant. You use it when needed, and when it's not needed, it rests. This shift is especially noticeable during difficult thoughts. When you stop trying to control them, you start to see their structure. You see how they begin, how they peak, how they fade. You see that they are temporary events, not permanent truths. And seeing this directly changes everything. Control wants certainty. Observation tolerates uncertainty. And uncertainty is where real change happens. When you're no longer forcing the mind to fit an ideal, you can listen to what it's actually doing. You begin to understand its patterns, its fears, its protective habits. This understanding naturally leads to a different kind of engagement. Instead of commanding the mind, you start to question it gently. Not, how do I stop this thought, but what is this thought trying to do? Not, how do I get rid of this feeling, but what meaning did my mind just assign here? And this shift opens the door to something far more powerful than control. It opens the door to inquiry. A simple, honest questioning that doesn't fight the mind but interrupts its automatic cycles. And once questioning becomes possible, a new kind of freedom begins to take shape. There is a quiet moment, often very brief, when a thought has appeared but has not yet taken full control. Most people miss it because it passes so quickly, but inside that moment lives an unexpected kind of power. Not the power to dominate the mind, but the power to interrupt it. And the simplest way to do that is with the right question, asked at the right time. A true question is not a statement in disguise. It's not something you already think you know the answer to. A real question opens space. It slows the momentum of thought just enough for awareness to step in. When the mind is caught in a loop, information doesn't help. Force doesn't help. But a well-placed question can break the spell. Consider how the mind usually works under stress. A thought appears, then quickly turns into a story. The story repeats, gathers emotion, and soon feels like reality. You're no longer seeing clearly. You're reacting. But if in that early moment you ask something simple like, what's actually happening right now? The loop hesitates. It doesn't know how to answer immediately. And in that hesitation, presence returns. The power is not in the words themselves, but in the shift of attention. Instead of being absorbed in the content of the thought, attention turns toward the process. You're no longer inside the story, You're looking at it, and looking changes the relationship. Many people ask the wrong kind of questions. Why am I like this? What's wrong with me? These questions assume a problem and reinforce self-judgment. They don't open space, they narrow it. The questions that matter are gentle and curious. They don't accuse, they inquire. For example, when a strong emotion arises, instead of asking how to get rid of it, you might ask, "What thought just passed through my mind?" That question doesn't demand an answer immediately. It simply directs attention. Often the answer appears on its own, a short phrase, an image, a remembered situation. And once that thought is seen, the emotion begins to loosen its grip. The timing is essential. Ask too late, and the mind is already fully identified. Ask too early, and it becomes mechanical. The right moment is when you feel the first shift inside, the tightening, the urgency, the familiar emotional signal. That signal is not a problem, it's an invitation. Questions also work because the mind cannot argue with them in the same way it argues with statements. A statement invites contradiction, a question invites exploration. When you ask, "Is this thought absolutely true?" the mind pauses. It may still insist, but the certainty weakens, and certainty is what keeps thoughts powerful. Over time, you'll notice that certain questions resonate more deeply than others. Not because they are clever, but because they point attention back to direct experience. Questions like, "What am I assuming here?" or "What am I reacting to right now?" These don't require philosophy. They require honesty. There's also something important to understand about questioning. It's not about solving the mind like a puzzle. It's about seeing it clearly. The moment you see clearly, many problems dissolve on their own. Not because they were fixed, but because they were sustained by misunderstanding. This approach changes how you relate to difficult moments. Instead of bracing yourself or fighting internally, you become curious. Curiosity softens resistance. It replaces tension with interest, and interest keeps you present. You may also notice that the right question often leads to silence, not more thinking. The mind looks for an answer and finds none immediately. In that gap, there is awareness without commentary. That silence is not empty, it's alert, and from it, a more appropriate response can emerge naturally. As this becomes familiar, you stop asking questions as a technique and start living them as an attitude. Life becomes less about reacting and more about noticing, less about controlling outcomes and more about understanding processes. What's especially powerful is that questions can be asked anywhere, in the middle of a conversation, during a stressful moment at work, while lying awake at night. You don't need special conditions. You only need the willingness to pause for half a second and look inward. And something else becomes clear as you practice this. The mind's patterns are not as solid as they once seemed. They rely on speed and invisibility. When questioned, they slow down. When seen, they soften. This naturally leads to a deeper realization. If a simple question can interrupt a powerful mental loop, then perhaps the most transformative action is not interference, but attention itself. Perhaps observing with presence does more than any effort to change what appears. And that possibility invites a closer look at what happens when you stop interfering altogether and simply watch. At first, it feels counterintuitive. Everything you've learned suggests that if something inside you isn't working well, you should step in and fix it. Change it, improve it, do something. So when you hear that observing is more powerful than interfering, the mind resists. It sounds passive, almost irresponsible. But this resistance itself comes from a misunderstanding of what observation really is. Interfering comes from the urge to control outcomes. A thought appears and you try to redirect it. An emotion arises and you attempt to manage it. You step in quickly, often with good intentions, but the underlying message is the same. This shouldn't be happening. That message creates tension, and tension is the fuel that keeps inner conflict alive. Observation, on the other hand, does not carry an agenda. When you observe, you are not trying to make the thought disappear or the emotion go away. You are simply allowing it to be seen clearly. That clarity changes everything, not by force, but by understanding. Think about how the mind behaves when it feels watched versus when it feels controlled. Control provokes resistance. Observation invites honesty. When you interfere, the mind tightens, it hides, it argues. When you observe, the mind reveals itself. Patterns become visible, motives become clearer, and once something is clearly seen, it rarely needs to be fought. Most mental suffering persists not because thoughts are strong, but because they operate unnoticed. They run in the background, shaping perception and emotion without ever being questioned. Observation turns on the light, and light doesn't need to push darkness away. Darkness disappears on its own when it's seen. This is why simply noticing a thought can reduce its impact. You're no longer inside it, you're not acting from it, you're aware of it. That awareness creates distance, and distance creates freedom. The thought may still be there, but it no longer defines the entire moment. Interfering keeps you engaged in the content of the mind. Observing shifts you to the context. Instead of asking, "How do I change this thought?" you're experiencing, "This is a thought appearing in awareness." That shift is subtle, but it's profound. It moves you from identification to presence. There's also a deeper intelligence at work here. The mind, when not under attack, has a natural tendency toward balance. Just as the body heals itself when given the right conditions, the mind settles when it's not constantly being corrected. Observation provides those conditions. It offers space instead of pressure. This doesn't mean you never take action. It means action arises from clarity rather than compulsion. When you observe first, any response that follows is more aligned, more appropriate to the actual situation, rather than a reflex from the past. Many people confuse observation with detachment. They worry that if they stop interfering, they'll become indifferent or passive. But true observation is deeply engaged. You're present with what's happening. You feel it fully. The difference is that you're not adding a layer of resistance or judgment on top of it. Notice how often interference is driven by fear. Fear of losing control, fear of feeling something uncomfortable, fear of not being good enough if the mind isn't perfectly calm. Observation doesn't eliminate fear immediately, but it changes your relationship with it. Fear becomes something you see, not something you are. As you practice this, you'll notice moments where the mind expects interference. A familiar thought arises, and there's an impulse to fix it. When you don't follow that impulse, there may be a brief sense of uncertainty. The mind doesn't know what to do with space. But if you stay present, something unexpected happens. The thought runs out of energy. It completes itself and fades. This is not because you ignored it, but because you saw it fully. Interference often cuts thoughts off prematurely, leaving them unresolved. Observation allows them to finish their movement. And when they finish, they don't need to repeat themselves as often. Over time, this builds trust. You begin to trust awareness more than effort. You see that you don't need to manage every inner event. You need to be present for it. That presence is enough, and something else becomes clear through this process. The more you observe, the more you sense that awareness itself is stable. Thoughts change, emotions shift, sensations come and go, but the one who observes remains, quiet, unmoving, always here. This realization naturally leads to a deeper question, one that arises not from curiosity alone, but from direct experience. If there is something within you that observes everything, and yet does not think, does not react, does not change, then what exactly is your true self? And if that self is already present, quietly perceiving, what role does thinking actually play in who you are? There comes a moment, often quiet and easy to miss, when you begin to sense that the one who is aware of your thoughts is not thinking at all. Thoughts move, they speak, they comment, but something else is simply here, perceiving everything without effort. This is not an idea to believe in. It's something you can notice directly, once attention shifts from what is being thought to what is aware of the thinking. Your true self does not think. It perceives. It notices thoughts as they arise, emotions as they move through the body, sensations as they change. It doesn't need to label them or explain them in order to be present. Perception happens before words, before interpretation, before meaning. This can feel strange at first because identity has long been tied to thinking. You've learned to describe yourself through opinions, preferences, memories, and plans. So when you discover a part of you that exists without any of that, the mind feels uncertain. It asks, if I'm not my thoughts, then who am I? But that question itself belongs to the thinking layer. The perceiving self doesn't need an answer. It already knows itself by being itself. Notice how perception works in simple moments. You hear a sound. For a brief instant there is just hearing. No thought yet, no judgment. Then the mind steps in and names it, interprets it, reacts to it. But the hearing happened first. The same is true internally. Awareness is already present before the mind explains what's happening. This perceiving self is not distant or abstract. It's intimate. It's closer than thought because thought appears within it. When you feel an emotion, something knows that emotion is happening. That knowing is perception. When a thought says, "I'm not enough," something hears that sentence. That hearing is not the sentence itself. The more you notice this, the more your relationship with thinking changes. Thoughts stop feeling like commands and start feeling like messages, useful sometimes, misleading at other times, but never the final authority. You don't need to eliminate them to know who you are. You just need to see where they appear. This also explains why deep clarity often comes in moments of stillness, not because you thought harder, but because thinking softened and perception became primary. Insight doesn't come from mental noise. It comes from seeing. And seeing doesn't require effort. The perceiving self is always calm, not because nothing happens, but because it doesn't resist what happens. Resistance belongs to thought. Perception simply receives. It allows. That allowance creates a sense of inner stability, even when life is unpredictable. This doesn't mean you stop using the mind. Thinking remains a valuable tool. But tools are meant to be used, not confused with who you are. When the tool rests, you are still here. When thoughts pause, awareness does not disappear. That alone tells you something essential. As this understanding deepens, you may notice a natural compassion arising, not forced, not idealistic, but quiet and grounded. When you see that your own mind runs on conditioning and habit, you begin to recognize the same in others. Reactivity becomes more understandable. Judgment softens, and with that softness comes a new kind of freedom. You no longer need to defend every thought or justify every emotion. You can let experiences pass through awareness without clinging to them. Life feels less like a battle of ideas and more like a flow of moments. Yet there is still one misunderstanding that often remains. Even after recognizing the perceiving self, the mind may try to claim it. It may turn perception into another identity. Now I know who I am. But that knowing quickly becomes another thought. The perceiving self cannot be captured by thought because it is what sees thought. It's not an object you can hold. It's the subject that cannot be turned into an object. You can only rest as it, not think about it. And as this resting becomes more familiar, another realization naturally follows. If the true self perceives rather than thinks, then the mind's constant activity may not be necessary for guidance or protection in the way you once believed. This opens a deeper inquiry into the role the mind actually plays, not as an enemy, but as something that has been trying in its own limited way to help. When you look closely with honesty rather than frustration, you may begin to see something that changes the entire relationship you have with your mind. The mind you've been trying to control, silence, or fix is not trying to harm you. It is trying to protect you. Its methods may be outdated, clumsy, or excessive, but its intention is rooted in survival. Every anxious thought, every warning, every repetitive mental loop is the mind's attempt to prevent pain. It scans the past for danger and projects that danger into the future, hoping that anticipation will keep you safe. From its perspective, worry is preparation. Fear is caution. Self-criticism is a way to avoid rejection by correcting yourself before the world does. The problem is not that the mind wants to protect you. The problem is that it learned how to protect you a long time ago in situations that may no longer apply. It uses old maps to navigate new territory, and because it doesn't know the present moment directly, it relies on memory, on patterns, on what once hurt. This is why the mind repeats the same themes. Be careful. Don't trust. Don't stand out. Don't fail. These messages may feel limiting now, but at some point they were useful. They helped you adapt. They helped you belong. They helped you avoid pain when you didn't have many other options. When you fight the mind, you miss this context. You treat it like an enemy that needs to be defeated. And the mind responds the only way it knows how, by becoming louder, more insistent, more dramatic. It increases the volume of its warnings because it believes you're not listening. This is why control often backfires. The more you try to suppress thoughts, the more they push back, not out of rebellion, but out of fear. The mind is afraid that if it stops monitoring, something bad will happen, so it keeps talking. When you begin to observe the mind with understanding instead of resistance, something shifts. You start to hear the intention beneath the noise. You recognize the protective impulse inside the anxious thought, the desire for safety inside the controlling habit, the need for certainty inside the constant planning. This recognition doesn't mean you agree with the mind or obey it. It means you acknowledge it, and acknowledgement is calming. When the mind feels seen, it doesn't need to shout as much. Just like a worried part of you settles when it's listened to, the mind relaxes when it's not being attacked. This is where compassion becomes practical, not sentimental, not self-indulgent, but grounded. You stop saying, "My mind is broken," and start seeing, "My mind is trying to help, but it doesn't know the full picture." That perspective alone reduces inner conflict. From this place, guidance changes. Instead of commands and rules, there is dialogue. Instead of forcing silence, there is listening. You may notice that when you stop reacting to every thought, the mind begins to trust the deeper awareness you've discovered. It learns, slowly, that it doesn't have to be in charge all the time. The protective mind is very good at identifying potential problems. It is not very good at recognizing when danger has passed. Awareness, on the other hand, lives in the present. It sees what is actually happening now, not what might happen based on memory. When awareness leads, the mind can relax into a supportive role instead of a dominant one. This changes how you experience inner guidance. Decisions feel less frantic. Thoughts become more spacious. There is room for intuition, for subtle signals, for clarity that doesn't come from overthinking. And perhaps most importantly, this understanding dissolves the inner war. You no longer need to choose between being controlled by the mind or controlling it. There is a third option: partnership. Awareness sets the direction. The mind offers information. Together, they function far more effectively than when they are in conflict. As this relationship stabilizes, you may notice that thoughts naturally become quieter, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer driven by fear. The mind senses that something deeper is present, something capable of perceiving reality directly. From here, a final question quietly emerges. If mastery is not about fighting the mind, and not about forcing change, but about knowing who is observing and allowing the mind to serve rather than dominate, then what does it actually mean to live from that place, day after day, in real life? Mastering your thoughts is not about fighting them, silencing them, or trying to become someone with a perfectly calm mind. It's about remembering who is aware of them. Thoughts will continue to appear. Emotions will still move through you. But when you live from the place that observes, none of that needs to control you anymore. You don't win freedom by overpowering the mind. You find it by stepping out of identification and resting in awareness. From there, the mind can do what it was meant to do, serve, not rule. And life becomes lighter, clearer, more honest, not because it's perfect, but because you're present. If you stayed with me until the end, write this sentence in the comments so I know you were here. I am the one who observes. And if this message resonated with you, watch one of the videos on the screen now. If you want more content like this, simple, deep, and practical, that's where the next step continues.